I didn't say a word when they handed me that eviction notice. I just slid the 1923 water rights deed across the table and watched 35 McMansions turn into lakefront property. The Willowbrook Estates HOA thought they could steal my grandfather's farm while I was deployed in Afghanistan. These pompous bureaucrats built their perfect suburban paradise on stolen land, complete with tennis-outfitted Karens patrolling in golf carts. What they didn't know: I'm an Army Corps engineer. That little earth dam on my property had been waiting 45 years for someone stupid enough to build downstream. The audacity was truly something to behold until the spillway gates opened and their luxury development got its first taste of natural flooding. All this was going to be satisfying. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness the most beautiful HOA takedown involving federal water law and gravity. Let me introduce you to Jake Morrison. That's me. 34 years old, Army Corps of Engineers, and the third-generation owner of 47 acres of prime Texas land just outside Austin. My grandfather, who we all called Pops, bought this property back in 1955 when Austin was still a sleepy college town, and barbecue joints outnumbered tech companies by about 1,000 to 1. Pops was the kind of man who believed in taking care of the land and the people on it. In 1978, he built a small earth dam on our property. Nothing fancy, just good engineering designed to collect rainwater for the cattle and help out our downstream neighbors during dry spells. The Army Corps of Engineers even helped him with the design. Pops always said that someday the back 40 acres would be worth something special, but for now it was just beautiful rolling hills where we ran cattle and I learned to hunt. Then came my 2 tours in Afghanistan, where I specialized in water management and infrastructure. Turns out building wells and managing water flow in a war zone teaches you a thing or two about how precious clean water really is and how quickly people will fight over it. While I was on my second deployment, Pops passed away. The property went into a trust managed by my well-meaning but overwhelmed sister Sarah, who lives in California and knows about as much about Texas land law as I know about surfing. She hired a local property management company called Lone Star Land Services to handle the taxes and upkeep. The property taxes got paid automatically. But here's the thing: Sarah never actually looked at the tax assessment. Big mistake. Enter our villain, Margaret Maggie Thornwell, 52 years old, president of Willowbrook Estates HOA, and the kind of woman who drives a white BMW X7 and treats tennis outfits like business attire. Maggie's got that particular brand of passive-aggressive sweetness that's Southern women perfect around age 45. You know, the kind where they'll smile while they're stabbing you in the back and somehow make it sound like they're doing you a favor. Maggie's married to City Councilman Rick Thornwell, which should tell you everything you need to know about how she gets things done. She's got a reputation for neighborhood beautification initiatives, which is fancy talk for forcing out anyone who doesn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. The smell of her expensive perfume can't quite mask the stench of cigarette smoke and entitlement that follows her around like a cloud. I came home from deployment in August 2023, ready to finally spend some real time on Pop's land. Drove down that familiar gravel road, past the old oak tree where I'd carved my initials as a kid, expecting to see the same rolling pastures and that little earth dam sparkling in the Texas sun. Instead, I found construction crews, concrete trucks, and survey stakes scattered across my back 40 like some kind of suburban invasion. The crunch of gravel under my boots felt different somehow, angrier. I could taste the dust and my own rising fury as I marched up to the construction foreman. "Sorry, buddy," he said, not looking sorry at all. "We got permits and everything. This is Willowbrook Estates property now." I called the police. Officer Martinez showed up and explained with obvious discomfort that the HOA had filed an adverse possession claim while I was overseas. Apparently, when nobody's actively using land for a certain period, and if you can prove you've been improving it, you can sometimes claim ownership. It's an old law designed to prevent land from sitting empty forever, but it's become a favorite tool of developers and HOAs looking to expand their empire. That's when Maggie appeared, riding up in her little golf cart like some kind of suburban warlord. Her voice had that syrupy sweetness that immediately made me want to check my wallet. "Your family abandoned this land, honey," she said, smiling like she was doing me a favor. "We're just putting it to good use for the community." But here's what really got my blood boiling. I discovered that her construction crews had diverted the small creek that feeds Pop's Dam. The water level was dropping every single day, and with it, 45 years of careful water management that had helped our neighbors through droughts, floods, and everything in between. As I stood there watching the water level drop, Maggie's parting shot echoed in my ears. "You should have stayed closer to home, soldier boy." That's when I knew this wasn't just about land. It was war. I hired the first attorney I could find. Big mistake. This guy quoted me $85,000 just to challenge the zoning change. Turns out while I was serving my country, Maggie's husband, Rick, had pushed through an emergency zoning modification. My family's land went from agricultural pre-validation to residential development zone faster than you can say conflict of interest. But here's where my Army Corps training came in handy. While that overpriced lawyer was shuffling papers and billing hours, I was digging through the county records like I was hunting for IEDs. And just like in Afghanistan, the devil was in the details. I found Pop's original 1978 dam construction permits, and they were beautiful. See, Pops didn't just build that dam himself. He worked directly with the Army Corps of Engineers for flood control and watershed management. That meant federal jurisdiction. And here's your first knowledge nugget. Any dam built with federal guidance creates federal jurisdiction that local HOAs can't override, period. The metallic taste of adrenaline hit my tongue as I realized what I'd found. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a federal case. But wait, it gets better. While I was photocopying permits at the courthouse, I stumbled across a 1923 water rights deed buried in the old records. My great-grandfather had purchased senior water rights to the entire Willow Creek watershed. These rights were older than the city, older than the county's municipal water system, older than every single one of those McMansions sitting on my land. They weren't just stealing my property. They were stealing my water. Meanwhile, Maggie was busy playing the victim. She organized an emergency HOA meeting about the dangerous dam structure. Complete with a local news crew she'd obviously tipped off in advance. I watched her on the evening news, standing in front of her perfectly manicured lawn, talking about children's safety and neighborhood security. "We're just concerned about our children's safety," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "That dam looks ready to burst, and we have families living right downstream." The funny thing about local news is they love a good story, but they're not always great with follow-up research. If they'd bothered to check, they would have found that my dam had passed its most recent safety inspection with flying colors. But Maggie wasn't done. She posted on the Nextdoor app, that digital neighborhood watch where HOA presidents go to flex their petty authority. Her post warned about aggressive property disputes and unstable individuals in the area. She never mentioned my name, but she didn't have to. In a community that small, everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with cedar pollen hung heavy in the August air as I stood on my front porch each evening, watching their construction crews work double shifts. They were racing to finish those houses before I could get any kind of legal injunction. Every night I counted new foundation pours. Every night the water level in Pop's Dam dropped another inch. That's when I called my old Army buddy Tony Riggs, who now works for the EPA Enforcement Division. 20 minutes on the phone with Tony taught me more about environmental law than 3 hours with that expensive attorney. "Jake," Tony said, "if they're diverting a natural waterway without federal permits, that's a Clean Water Act violation. And if your dam has federal jurisdiction," he didn't need to finish the sentence. I started documenting everything. Trail cameras around the property perimeter, time-stamped photos of every water diversion, flow measurements at 3 different points along the creek. My sister Sarah called from California, begging me to just take the money and walk away. But this wasn't about money anymore. Maggie decided to turn up the heat. She organized what she called a neighborhood safety patrol. 3 HOA board members in matching polo shirts who parked at my property entrance like some kind of suburban checkpoint. They photographed every visitor, wrote down license plates, and filed reports with the sheriff about suspicious activity. The harassment campaign was textbook intimidation. Loud music complaints when I ran my radio during farm work. Unsightly structures citations for my perfectly functional farmhouse that had been standing since 1962. Environmental hazards reports about my septic system that had passed inspection just 6 months earlier. But the real kick in the teeth came when Rick used his city council position to order a wellness check on me through Veteran Services. Apparently, I was a troubled veteran who might be struggling with readjustment issues. The social worker who showed up was apologetic but thorough. She had to check boxes on her clipboard while Maggie watched from her golf cart like she was supervising a military inspection. That's when the coordinated bureaucratic assault began. Building inspector, fire marshal, health department, and animal control all showed up on the same day like some kind of regulatory SWAT team. Each one found minor violations requiring expensive corrections. The building inspector, who happened to be a drinking buddy of Rick's, declared that my front porch needed $8,000 in foundation work. I recognized the squeeze play immediately. It's the same tactic they use in war zones to pressure local officials. Overwhelm them with bureaucracy until they give up and cooperate. But two can play that game. While they were drowning me in paperwork, I was making some phone calls of my own. Tony Riggs at the EPA was very interested to learn that Maggie's HOA had never filed the required wetlands assessment before redirecting Willow Creek. Turns out any development that redirects natural waterways requires federal environmental clearance, even on private property. And the fines for violations start at $50,000 per day. The smell of fresh concrete curing in the summer heat reminded me every morning that I was running out of time. But my research was paying off in ways Maggie never expected. I discovered that their entire development had been built in what the Army Corps classified as a 100-year floodplain. Insurance companies had initially refused coverage until the HOA provided a flood mitigation plan. Their solution: permanently divert Willow Creek away from the new homes and let it flood my property instead. Here's your second knowledge nugget. Insurance fraud in development projects often carries criminal penalties, not just civil ones. When developers lie about flood risks to get coverage, that's federal mail fraud. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't Maggie's first rodeo. Her previous HOA in Houston had paid a $2.3 million EPA fine for an identical creek diversion scheme. She'd left town just ahead of the federal prosecutors and set up shop here in Austin, looking for new victims. But while she was busy playing the victim, I was building alliances. I connected with other HOA victims through online forums and discovered a pattern. Maggie's HOA had absorbed 6 smaller properties through similar tactics over the past 3 years. Each time, the story was the same: pressure, harassment, bureaucratic warfare, and mysterious zoning changes that always seemed to benefit Rick's construction company. I partnered with my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chun, whose family garden had withered since the creek diversion. I met Miguel Santos, whose family farm had been rezoned out of existence by Rick Thornwell 2 years earlier. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic land grab. Then I got the certified letter. The city was planning to seize my property through eminent domain for public safety. The hearing was scheduled in just 2 weeks. Maggie's quote in the paper made her strategy crystal clear. Sometimes you have to protect the community from itself. But as I stood at my bedroom window that night watching storm clouds gather on the horizon, I realized something important. Those weren't just rain clouds building up. They were opportunity. While digging through dusty courthouse records for the 3rd time that week, I found a misfiled document that changed everything. Buried behind a stack of 1979 tax assessments was the original agricultural flood management covenant from Pop's Dam construction. The language was beautiful in its simplicity. Dam operators shall maintain natural seasonal flow patterns to preserve downstream agricultural water rights in perpetuity. This wasn't just permission to manage flooding. It was a legal obligation that superseded any HOA agreements or city ordinances. During my nighttime reconnaissance, old habits from the Army, I discovered something beautiful. Pop's Dam wasn't just a simple earthwork structure. The original 1978 design included an emergency spillway system with hydraulic gates that hadn't been opened since 1982. The hollow echo of water flowing through those underground spillway channels during my midnight tests told me everything I needed to know. The mechanism was still functional, and it was designed for exactly this situation: controlled flooding to restore natural water flow patterns. As storm clouds gathered on the horizon, I made the decision that would change everything. Time to honor Pop's legacy and open those gates. You don't just open a dam without a plan. This wasn't revenge. It was a military operation with legal cover, environmental justification, and community support. I assembled my team. My attorney Amanda Cross, Tony Riggs at the EPA, Miguel Santos, and Mrs. Chun. Our strategy was to control the narrative before Maggie could spin it. We scheduled the spillway opening for the same time federal EPA investigators were arriving and when heavy rains were predicted. Maggie's desperation reached new levels. She hired private security to sabotage the spillway. They were arrested. Went on the morning news to call me a disturbed veteran. And even got a corrupt judge to schedule an emergency restraining order hearing for 6 a.m. But we were ready for every move. At 7:02 a.m., with federal agents watching and the morning sun painting the sky orange, I opened the spillway gates to 25% capacity. The sound was magnificent. Not the violent rush of destruction, but the gentle whisper of water returning home. For the first time in 18 months, Willow Creek began flowing in its original bed. Miguel Santos knelt beside the restored creek and cupped the clear water in his weathered hands, tears streaming down his face. "This is the water that fed my grandfather's farm for 60 years, he whispered. Maggie's reaction was immediate and predictable. She screamed at the federal agents to arrest the terrorist, but EPA agent Sarah Kim calmly explained, "Ma'am, this gentleman has the legal right to operate his agricultural flood control system. The water wasn't flooding anything. It was flowing exactly where it belonged." The local news helicopters broadcast the operation live, and Maggie's narrative collapsed in real time. The courtroom hearing that afternoon was the final reckoning. Amanda presented overwhelming evidence. The 1978 covenant, proof of insurance fraud, and documentation of Maggie's previous $2.3 million fine in Houston. When a recorded phone call of Rick screaming about property values and campaign contributions was played, the conspiracy was laid bare. Judge Walsh had no choice. He denied all restraining orders and ruled my operation was legal and beneficial. 6 months later, justice flowed as naturally as the restored creek. Rick pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges and got 3 years in prison. Maggie faced $8.7 million in civil penalties and filed for bankruptcy. The HOA dissolved. My property value restored to $1.2 million. The community was transformed. The restored creek now attracts ecotourism where McMansions were supposed to stand. I established the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship, and Miguel's daughter was the first recipient. From my porch each evening, watching that creek flow exactly where it belongs, I'm reminded that some fights are worth everything you've got. Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek.